The type of night where everything feels normal. Everything feels safe. But just when you think the past is behind you, a single knock at the door is about to flip your world upside down. And that's how it begins. A woman, who thought her darkest secret was safely buried in the past, finds herself face to face with the man she believed she had killed. A decade ago, she made a choice. She took matters into her own hands, ending a marriage that had become a prison of fear and control. But now, 10 years later, that man is alive, and standing on her doorstep. What would you do if the one thing you thought was buried forever, suddenly walked back into your life? This isn't just a story about a crime. It's a story of guilt, fear, and the terrifying consequences of living with a lie so dark, you can't even let yourself believe it could come true. It's a tale of a woman who thought she had won, but the past has a way of finding us when we least expect it. The woman at the center of this story, called Sarah, was a woman who had once been full of hope. She had dreams. She had a future. But all that changed the moment she married Charles. From the outside, they seemed like the perfect couple. He was wealthy, well-connected, and seemed to adore her. But behind closed doors, Charles was a different person. As the years went by, Sarah's life became a nightmare. She had married a man who was controlling, manipulative, and, at times, violent. He used his power and money to trap her, isolating her from friends, family, and any form of support. The pressure weighed heavily on Sarah, and she saw no way out. She was living in constant fear of what he might do next. The emotional scars were starting to take their toll. Then one night, everything changed. The breaking point came when Charles became violent once again, but this time, something inside Sarah snapped. She knew she couldn't live like this anymore. In a moment of desperation, she made the decision to take his life, to end the torment that had been consuming her for years. She drugged him, then strangled him with a pillow. But that wasn't the hardest part. The hardest part was what came after. After she killed him, she had to make it look like he had disappeared without a trace. She couldn't afford for anyone to find out the truth. So, she went to extreme lengths to hide his body. She dug a grave in a secluded part of the forest, wrapped him in plastic, and buried him deep in the earth. For years, it seemed like the perfect crime. The police didn't suspect her. The case grew cold. She moved away, started a new life, even remarried. But the guilt never left her. It gnawed at her every day, but she kept telling herself that she was finally free. And then, 10 years later, that knock came. Sarah was sitting at home, going through her daily routine, when she heard the unmistakable sound, a loud, deliberate knock at the door. She wasn't expecting anyone. But when she opened it, there he was. Charles. Alive. Standing on her doorstep. The man she had buried, the man she thought was gone forever, was back. At first, she couldn't believe her eyes. Was she hallucinating? Was this some sick joke? But when he stepped inside, looking just as she remembered, older, maybe a little disheveled, but unmistakably him, everything she thought she had buried was suddenly brought to life. But how could this be? How was it possible? Was he really dead all those years ago, or had something happened that Sarah didn't know about? And why, after all this time, was he now showing up at her door? The truth, as it turns out, is more twisted and complicated than Sarah could have ever imagined. As the story unfolds, we learn that Charles had indeed been left for dead. But something about his death didn't add up. The police investigation had been rushed, incomplete. The body that Sarah had buried wasn't really his. And Charles had managed to escape, alive, but not without serious consequences. It turns out that Charles had a secret of his own. A plan to fake his death. To disappear and rebuild his life in a way that no one would ever suspect. And the woman who thought she had gotten away with murder was now facing the reality of her actions. What would you do if the crime you thought was buried came back to haunt you? What lengths would you go to in order to cover up the past? Sarah would soon learn that no matter how deep you bury a secret, the truth has a way of coming to the surface. As the tension between them grows, Sarah must figure out how to navigate the mess she's created. Her world is spiraling, and she has no idea what Charles wants, or what he's planning. Could he be seeking revenge? Or is there a deeper reason he's come back? The final twist of the story is one that no one saw coming. As secrets unravel and trust crumbles, Sarah's life will be forever changed. But what about Charles? What has he been hiding all these years? This is a story of survival, betrayal, and the high price of lies. It's a tale of how one choice, a single moment of desperation, can haunt you for a lifetime. And how sometimes, the past refuses to stay buried. To understand the shocking events that would eventually spiral into murder and betrayal, we must first take a step back into the lives of Sarah and Charles. Their story begins like many others, two people who were supposed to be a perfect match. The kind of match that everyone around them would envy. But beneath the surface, there were deep cracks waiting to break apart the illusion they worked so hard to build. Sarah wasn't always the woman trapped in her own fear. In fact, before she met Charles, she had dreams of a happy, peaceful life. She was a bright young woman, full of ambition and hope. Raised in a modest family, Sarah grew up in a close-knit neighborhood. Her parents were hardworking, and they had instilled in her values of honesty, kindness, and a strong sense of right and wrong. She was always encouraged to pursue her dreams and be independent. Sarah, in her youth, was filled with hope for the future and optimism about finding a love that would complete her. Her path seemed set for a bright future, until the fateful day she met Charles. Charles came into Sarah's life like a whirlwind. He was everything she wasn't. He was older, charming, suave, and confident. He was a man with a history, a successful entrepreneur with wealth that most people could only dream of. He had a reputation for being well-connected in high society, respected by peers and admired by those who were lucky enough to be in his circle. To Sarah, he was a knight in shining armor, the kind of man she never thought she could get. At first, everything felt like a fairy tale. He wooed her with gifts, expensive dinners, and promises of a life full of adventure. He told her that he saw something special in her, a light that no one else had. He made her feel beautiful, desired, and important in ways she had never experienced before. The moments they spent together were filled with laughter and joy. There were promises of future vacations in exotic destinations and long, meaningful talks about life and dreams. But as their relationship deepened, Sarah began to notice things that didn't add up. There was something in Charles's behavior that left her uneasy, but she couldn't quite place it. When they were alone, he was often controlling, insisting on making all the decisions for them. At first, he was subtle about it, offering advice here and there, but over time, it became more pronounced. Sarah's choices seemed to disappear, replaced by Charles's vision of their life together. Charles began to isolate her from her family and friends, slowly chipping away at her support system. "They don't understand you like I do," he would say when she talked about her parents or childhood friends. "They only want to keep you tied to the past. I'm offering you something greater." These words echoed in her mind, slowly planting seeds of doubt about her old life. Her independence started to fade, replaced by a growing dependence on him. At first, Sarah didn't see it. After all, he was her husband now. She believed it was normal to rely on him. But deep down, a quiet part of her whispered that something wasn't right. As the months passed, the cracks in Charles's charming exterior began to show. He became more possessive, checking her phone, asking where she had been at all hours of the day and night, questioning her interactions with anyone who wasn't him. What started as a concern for her safety slowly morphed into something far darker, a need for control, a deep-rooted jealousy that bordered on obsession. It wasn't just the constant questioning and surveillance. Charles also had a temper, one that flared up without warning. He could go from calm and collected to explosive in a matter of seconds. And once he was angry, his words were sharp, cutting deeper than anyone could have imagined. He would belittle her, make her feel insignificant, telling her that no one else would want her. "I'm the best thing that's ever happened to you," he'd remind her with a cold smile. But it wasn't just the verbal abuse. Charles had a way of using his wealth and status to manipulate the world around him. Sarah noticed how he would use his money to buy people's loyalty, his charm to smooth over situations, and his influence to silence anyone who threatened his perfect image. Slowly but surely, Sarah began to feel trapped. She no longer had control of her life. Charles held the keys to her freedom, her sense of self, and her very identity. There were moments when she could see the man he used to be, the man she had fallen in love with. But those moments were rare, fleeting, almost like glimpses of a person lost within the monstrous version he had become. And every time she thought about leaving, about walking away from the marriage, she was confronted with an overwhelming wave of fear. He would threaten to take everything from her, her life, her friends, her dignity. If you've made it this far into the story, you've seen the twists and turns that led to this shocking moment. Now, if you can't even hit the like button or subscribe after hearing this, what does that say about you? You don't want to miss out on the rest of this gripping story, do you? Go ahead and hit that like button, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you don't regret it later. Trust me, you'll be glad you did. Don't let this story slip by without supporting it. I'm counting on you. But what truly changed everything, the point of no return, was one evening in late fall. It was a quiet night, and Charles had returned home after a business trip. He was in a foul mood. As usual, it started with an argument about something trivial, but it escalated quickly. Sarah found herself standing in the living room, her back pressed against the wall as Charles raged on, throwing accusations at her. "You're worthless. No one cares about you. You think you can do better than me? Think again." His words were venomous, meant to break her down, and that night they did. In a blind moment of panic, Sarah did what she had never thought herself capable of. She grabbed the closest object, a heavy paperweight, and swung it at him. It hit him hard in the side of the head, knocking him to the ground. He didn't move. For a split second, Sarah thought he was dead. But Charles wasn't dead. He was just unconscious, his body lying lifeless on the floor. She stood frozen, heart pounding in her chest. And that was when it all became clear, she had crossed a line she couldn't uncross. The guilt hit her like a wave, suffocating her. She panicked. She knew the police would never believe it was an accident, that she was the innocent victim in all this. She could already imagine the headlines, the rumors, and the whispers. She couldn't let that happen. Not now. Not after everything she had endured. In that moment of sheer terror, she made a decision, one that would change her life forever. Charles had to die. But this wasn't a crime of passion, not really. It was a decision born of desperation, a warped sense of survival. Charles's fate had already been sealed. Sarah, in her mind, had no other choice. She had to make it look like an accident. She had to bury him. And so, under the cover of darkness, she carried out her plan. She wrapped his body in a tarp, dragged it out to the car, and drove to the isolated woods where she had carefully prepared a grave. With trembling hands, she buried him, deep enough to be hidden from the world. By the time the sun rose, Charles was gone, his body a secret, his death an unanswered question. But deep down, Sarah knew that no matter how far she ran from the truth, she couldn't escape the consequences. No matter how much time passed, she would always carry the weight of that decision. Little did she know, this would not be the end of her story. This would be just the beginning. The crime, while meticulously planned, would ultimately be the beginning of a whirlwind of events that no one could have predicted. Sarah had thought she could bury the past, bury the man who had controlled her life, and move on in peace. But she was wrong. The lie she crafted, as carefully as she had buried Charles's body, was about to unravel, and the truth would soon come to light in ways she couldn't control. It was late one evening when Sarah's phone rang. The number was unfamiliar. At first, she ignored it, hoping it would go away. But something in the back of her mind urged her to answer. She was startled when a calm voice on the other end spoke her name. "Sarah Thompson." "Yes." She replied, her heart racing, her palms suddenly clammy. "This is Officer Martin from the Springdale Police Department. We have some questions regarding your husband, Charles. Can you come down to the station?" The question caught her off guard, sending a shockwave through her body. Her first instinct was panic. How did they find out? Had someone seen something, heard something? Had the body been discovered? She went numb as she listened to Officer Martin's request for her to come in immediately. She barely managed to mutter a reply before hanging up, her thoughts a chaotic blur. The next morning, Sarah sat nervously in the sterile interrogation room of the Springdale Police Department. The walls seemed to close in on her as the minutes ticked by. Her mind raced with a million possible scenarios, but she knew she had to remain calm. She told herself that she was strong, that the lies she had so carefully crafted would protect her. But nothing about this felt real anymore. The world felt like it was spinning around her, and she was helpless to stop it. When Officer Martin and his partner, Detective Carter, walked in, Sarah's heart skipped a beat. They had stern faces, expressions that gave nothing away. It was clear that this wasn't just a friendly chat about her missing husband. They were here because they suspected something. The air grew thick with tension as they sat across from her, their eyes never leaving hers. "Sarah," Detective Carter began, "we're not here to accuse you of anything. But we need your help. Your husband has been missing for over a week. His family reported him gone 2 days ago, and we're trying to track down his whereabouts. Can you tell us when you last saw him?" Sarah took a deep breath, her mind racing to keep her story straight. She remembered the night, the cold night when she buried Charles's body like it was yesterday. But she couldn't show that, couldn't let them see the fear in her eyes. She painted a picture of concern, recounting the supposed last night they spent together, a harmless disagreement about dinner plans, nothing that would make anyone suspect that she was involved in his disappearance. She explained how Charles had stormed off, angry about something trivial, and how she hadn't seen him since. She played the role of the worried wife, insisting that she was clueless about his whereabouts. "I swear, I didn't know where he went. He just left, and I've been trying to reach him. I've been so worried." The detectives exchanged a glance, but said nothing. The silence in the room was heavy, suffocating. Sarah tried not to squirm under their gaze. It felt like they were reading her every thought, but she remained composed. She didn't give them anything to work with, nothing that could link her to his disappearance. But the investigation wasn't going to end there. While Sarah sat in that interrogation room, the detectives were already hard at work, piecing together what had truly happened in the days leading up to Charles's vanishing. The first break in the case came from the discovery of Charles's car. It had been abandoned in a parking lot several miles away from their home. The vehicle was locked, but inside the glove compartment, the police found a receipt for a hotel stay, one that Sarah had never mentioned. The date on the receipt? The night before Charles had allegedly stormed off. This opened up a new lead. The detectives found out that Charles had checked into the hotel, but there was no record of him leaving. The staff had no recollection of a man matching his description, and the surveillance cameras had mysteriously malfunctioned that night. The entire situation was odd. Why would Charles leave without saying anything to Sarah? And why hadn't he come back? What was going on? As the investigation continued, Sarah's nervousness began to seep into her conversations with the authorities. Her answers started to become more scripted, more rehearsed. Detective Carter, who had been observing her closely, began to suspect that there was something off about Sarah's story. But without concrete evidence, they couldn't move forward. That is, until they found something else. A neighbor came forward with a statement that would change everything. Lillian West, who lived 2 doors down from Sarah and Charles, had seen something strange in the days leading up to Charles's disappearance. Lillian had known Sarah for years and had always found her to be friendly and polite, but this time, there was something different in Sarah's demeanor. She claimed that, on the night Charles went missing, she had seen Sarah leaving her house in a hurry. She wasn't sure where Sarah had gone, but she had remembered it being strange because Sarah never went out at night without telling someone. Lillian wasn't the only one with suspicions. Several people had noticed Sarah acting strangely around the time of Charles's disappearance. One of Charles's business associates, who had been in frequent contact with him, reported that Charles had made a few cryptic comments about his marriage, about things not being as they seemed. "I don't know how much longer I can put up with this," he had said during a meeting just days before he vanished. The associate had assumed it was just another one of Charles's fits of frustration, but now, in hindsight, it seemed to be something more. Still, it wasn't enough to make an arrest. The police needed hard evidence, something that would tie Sarah to the crime. That's when they turned to forensics. Forensic investigators worked tirelessly to uncover the truth hidden in the evidence. They began to search the house more thoroughly, analyzing everything from fingerprints to DNA. It was during a routine sweep of the basement that they discovered something unusual. Underneath the floorboards, they found traces of blood, fresh, not old, blood. It was a minute amount, enough to be considered inconclusive, but it was enough to raise more questions. A forensic team took the blood sample for testing. While the results wouldn't come back immediately, it became clear that something was amiss. Why would there be blood under the floorboards? And why hadn't Sarah mentioned anything about an injury? Why had she kept such an important detail to herself? With the evidence starting to pile up against her, Sarah's nerves began to unravel. She had never been the criminal mastermind she had hoped to be. She had made mistakes, small ones at first, but now they were beginning to add up. The media frenzy around the case began to build. News outlets picked up the story of the missing millionaire, his wealthy family demanding answers, and the mysterious wife whose story just didn't add up. The public was hungry for answers, and as the investigation continued to unfold, the pressure on Sarah only grew. As days turned into weeks, the pressure on the authorities mounted. The case had become high-profile, and the detectives were running out of time. But the breakthrough finally came when the blood sample returned. It was Charles's blood, confirming the investigators' worst fear, that Sarah had been involved in his disappearance, possibly in his death. It was now just a matter of finding out how far the web of lies extended. The case was far from over, and the shocking twist that would reveal the true nature of Sarah's actions was yet to come. As the forensic evidence mounted, it was no longer a matter of if, but when. The Springdale Police Department had built a strong case, and Sarah Thompson was on the verge of becoming the prime suspect in her husband's disappearance and presumed death. But she was still just a woman in denial, holding on to the faint hope that she could somehow escape the consequences of her actions. She thought she had buried the truth, but it was rising back to the surface, like a corpse that refused to stay hidden. It was a cold morning when the police arrived at Sarah's home, their presence unmistakable. The flashing lights and sirens made it clear that the moment had come. Sarah had been expecting it, had been preparing for it ever since the investigation had started to close in on her. But no amount of preparation could have shielded her from the shock of seeing her world collapse in an instant. The officers knocked on her door, and when she answered, they didn't waste any time. "Sarah Thompson, you are under arrest for the murder of your husband, Charles Thompson," Officer Martin said, his voice firm and devoid of emotion. Sarah's face drained of color. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. Her eyes darted around the room as though searching for an escape, a way out of the nightmare that was unfolding around her. But there was nowhere to run. The walls she had so carefully built over the years were crumbling around her. The officers didn't give her a chance to respond. They cuffed her hands, read her rights, and led her out of the house, where a crowd had gathered. The media were already camped outside, cameras flashing as Sarah was escorted to the police car. The whispers of "murderer" echoed through the crowd as they followed her every step. It was clear that public opinion had already begun to shift against her. The media frenzy only intensified as Sarah was transported to the Springdale County Jail. News outlets nationwide picked up the story, each one speculating about the woman who had killed her millionaire husband and buried him beneath their home. They painted a picture of a calculating and cold-hearted woman, a femme fatale who had played the system and fooled everyone. The public couldn't get enough of it. Headlines screamed of betrayal, greed, and murder, and soon, Sarah's face became a symbol of the dark side of marriage. But it wasn't just the media that was shaping the narrative. The prosecution was ready to take on the case with full force, and they had every intention of securing a conviction. The evidence was overwhelming. The blood found under the floorboards, the suspicious hotel receipt, the missing persons report, every clue pointed to Sarah as the perpetrator. The prosecution's strategy was clear. They would paint Sarah as a woman who had grown tired of her wealthy, domineering husband and decided to take matters into her own hands. The charges against her were grave: first-degree murder, tampering with evidence, and conspiracy to commit murder. The prosecution argued that Sarah had meticulously planned Charles's death, using his own wealth and their shared home to hide the crime. They would show that she had carefully orchestrated the disappearance, staging it as a fight that led to him leaving, all the while knowing that he was dead and buried beneath their feet. The defense, however, was not going to go down without a fight. Sarah's attorney, Mark Harrison, had a different strategy in mind. He knew the case was going to be difficult, but he believed that there were holes in the prosecution's argument. While the evidence was compelling, Harrison believed that the prosecution was jumping to conclusions. After all, there was still no clear proof that Charles had been murdered, and no one had seen Sarah actually kill him. What they had were circumstantial pieces of evidence, none of which conclusively proved her guilt. Harrison's defense was based on two key arguments. First, he argued that there was a possibility that Charles had staged his own disappearance. He pointed to the hotel receipt, suggesting that Charles could have checked in with the intention of running away, perhaps leaving Sarah behind for reasons unknown. The defense would argue that Sarah, in her distress, had simply panicked when Charles went missing and had attempted to cover up his disappearance, not realizing the full gravity of what she was doing. Second, Harrison suggested that the blood found beneath the floorboards might not have been Charles's at all. The defense questioned the forensic methods, suggesting that contamination during the investigation might have led to inaccurate results. They also suggested that the blood could have come from an accident, perhaps an injury that had nothing to do with Charles's death. It was a long shot, but it was enough to cast doubt on the case. While the defense's strategy was solid, it wasn't enough to overcome the prosecution's momentum. The first blow to Sarah's case came when the forensic team presented the final results. The blood beneath the floorboards was, in fact, Charles's blood. The defense's theory that it could have been someone else's fell apart in the face of the undeniable evidence. The prosecution also uncovered more chilling details about Sarah's actions in the days leading up to Charles's disappearance. Surveillance footage from the hotel showed Sarah herself entering the hotel on the night Charles was supposed to have left, her face obscured but her presence undeniable. The legal battle became a public spectacle, with the courtroom becoming a theater for the drama that had captivated the nation. The prosecution called on expert witnesses to testify about the blood, the forensic evidence, and the psychological profile of Sarah Thompson. They painted her as a woman who had grown bored with her life, a woman who had everything but was still willing to destroy her husband to escape the confines of her wealthy marriage. The prosecution's closing statement was delivered with conviction: she killed him to get everything, his wealth, his life, his future, and then buried him like he was trash. This is not just a case of a missing person. This is a murder, plain and simple. But the defense wasn't ready to concede. In a final attempt to shift the narrative, Harrison called on a psychologist to testify that Sarah had been under extreme emotional distress due to her tumultuous relationship with Charles. The defense painted a picture of a woman who had felt trapped and helpless, a victim of her husband's controlling behavior who had simply snapped in a moment of despair. Harrison argued that Sarah had acted in self-defense, even though there was no concrete evidence to support that claim. As the trial dragged on, the media continued to shape public opinion. News outlets covered every development, every twist, and every dramatic courtroom moment. The public was divided. Some saw Sarah as a victim, trapped in a toxic marriage, while others saw her as a ruthless woman who had orchestrated the murder of a man she no longer cared about. The courtroom was filled with tension, each side battling for the truth, each side determined to come out victorious. Then, the unthinkable happened. During a particularly tense moment in the trial, Sarah broke down in court. She stood up and screamed, "I didn't mean to kill him. I didn't." Her outburst sent shockwaves through the room. For the first time, the jury saw the woman behind the facade of calm. Her confession, though not explicit, raised doubts in the minds of many. Was it an act of guilt? Or was it simply the emotional breakdown of a woman who had been overwhelmed by the pressure of the trial? The twist came when Sarah's attorney, Mark Harrison, seized upon this moment of vulnerability. He argued that Sarah's breakdown was evidence of her emotional state and that the murder, if it had occurred, was not premeditated. He suggested that Sarah's mental health should be taken into account during sentencing. As the trial continued, the case grew more complex, and the tension continued to rise. The battle was far from over, and as the jury prepared to deliberate, the outcome remained uncertain. The trial had been a spectacle from the moment it began, but as it entered its final stages, the tension in the courtroom was palpable. The jury, a panel of ordinary citizens, sat in silence as the two sides, prosecution and defense, continued their battle, each trying to convince them of the truth, each offering a different version of Sarah Thompson's role in her husband's death. The stakes were high, and the outcome of this case would not only determine Sarah's fate but would also send ripples through the public, media, and everyone who had followed the case from the beginning. The courtroom drama escalated with each passing day. The prosecution, led by District Attorney Laura Hayes, pulled out all the stops. They began by calling forensic experts to the stand, their testimonies unflinching in the face of defense attempts to discredit them. The most damning piece of evidence, aside from the blood found beneath the floorboards, was the autopsy report. The coroner confirmed that the cause of Charles Thompson's death was blunt force trauma, a fatal blow to the head. The defense had been attempting to suggest that Charles might have died accidentally or that his injuries weren't fatal, but the coroner's testimony shattered those hopes. Prosecutor Hayes didn't stop there. She brought in Sarah's former friends and acquaintances, each of whom painted a picture of a woman who had grown increasingly cold and calculating. One friend testified that Sarah had confided in her just days before Charles went missing, stating, "If I had to get rid of him, I would." The words hung in the air, as chilling as they were incriminating. These statements, combined with Sarah's financial struggles, hidden debts and a growing sense of dissatisfaction with her marriage, painted a portrait of a woman who had been pushed to the edge, willing to do anything to escape her reality. Then came the moment that left everyone in the courtroom breathless. The prosecution introduced a piece of shocking evidence, a video recording from a local security camera. The video showed Sarah entering the hotel on the night Charles was supposed to have disappeared. She was alone. She checked in, and then, a few hours later, checked out. What was she doing there? Was it mere coincidence? Or had she been making arrangements to bury her husband's body, ensuring that he was out of sight and out of mind? The defense team scrambled to explain the video. Sarah's attorney, Mark Harrison, tried to argue that Sarah was merely in the hotel to escape the media pressure and the growing tension at home, but it was a tough sell. The jury's eyes were fixed on Sarah, and the doubt in their minds was growing. As the trial progressed, it was clear that the defense was struggling to make their case. The accidental death defense was losing steam, especially in light of the new evidence. Harrison then changed tactics, shifting the focus back to Sarah's emotional state. He called in psychologists and mental health experts who testified about Sarah's fragile mental condition, her feelings of isolation, guilt, and confusion after years of a tumultuous marriage. Harrison argued that Sarah was not a cold-blooded killer but rather a woman pushed to her breaking point by circumstances beyond her control. The defense painted Sarah as a victim of her environment, a woman who had been emotionally abused by her husband and had acted in a moment of sheer desperation. But the prosecution wasn't buying it. They countered with a pointed question: was she a victim, or was she a mastermind? Their strategy had always been to portray Sarah as someone who had planned Charles's murder meticulously, hiding his body beneath the floorboards and even staging his disappearance. The prosecution reminded the jury that Sarah had not immediately called for help, had not even seemed particularly concerned when her husband was missing. Instead, she had gone about her life, as if nothing had changed. The prosecution called this a critical piece of evidence, one that demonstrated premeditation. Then came the turning point: Sarah herself was called to the stand. The courtroom fell silent as Sarah, visibly distressed, took the witness stand. The woman who had once been so poised, so composed, now seemed fragile and broken. Her eyes were red from crying, her hands trembling as she clutched the edge of the podium. Mark Harrison began his questioning gently, trying to bring out her side of the story. "Sarah, tell the jury what happened on that night," Harrison asked. Sarah hesitated, her voice barely a whisper. She spoke about the argument she and Charles had on the night of his disappearance. She described how, for the first time in years, she had felt truly afraid of him. It wasn't the first time Charles had been verbally abusive, but that night, things escalated. She had feared for her life, she admitted. She had feared that if she didn't act, she would never escape the marriage. And so, in a moment of panic, she struck him. The blow had been accidental, she claimed. But the details of that night were unclear. There was no solid proof of self-defense, and her emotions, her desperation, only muddied the waters. When asked about her actions in the days after Charles's disappearance, Sarah broke down. "I didn't know what to do," she cried. "I thought I could make it go away. I thought he would come back. I never meant to hurt him." The prosecution seized on this moment of vulnerability. They pointed out that, if Sarah had truly cared about Charles, she would have done everything in her power to find him when he went missing. Instead, she had done nothing. The final witness was a surprise: Charles's estranged sister, Emily Thompson. Emily testified that, before his death, Charles had been planning to confront Sarah about their marriage. He had grown suspicious of her behavior and was preparing to file for divorce. Emily painted a picture of Charles as a man who had tried to make his marriage work, despite Sarah's increasing discontent. The implication was clear: Sarah had not only killed her husband, but she had done so to avoid the consequences of a public divorce and the loss of her luxurious lifestyle. The trial was nearing its end, and closing arguments began. District Attorney Hayes delivered a blistering closing statement, outlining the overwhelming evidence against Sarah. "She lied, she manipulated, and she killed," Hayes said. "And now, it's time for justice." In contrast, Mark Harrison's closing was subdued but emotionally charged. He reminded the jury of Sarah's mental state, of her history of abuse, and of the desperation she had felt in that moment. She was not a monster, he argued. She was a woman at the end of her rope. And we should show her compassion. The jury deliberated for hours, weighing the evidence, the testimonies, and the emotional weight of the case. The room was heavy with anticipation as the jury filed back into the courtroom. The judge called the room to order, and Sarah's fate was about to be decided. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Sarah Thompson, guilty of second-degree murder," the foreman announced. A gasp filled the courtroom. Sarah's knees buckled beneath her, and she was helped back into her seat. The guilty verdict was a relief for many, but it also brought with it a sense of finality. The woman who had once lived a life of privilege and luxury was now facing the consequences of her actions. The prosecution had succeeded in proving that Sarah had killed her husband in a moment of calculated desperation, but there was no escaping the complexity of her emotions or the tragedy that had led her to this point. Sarah's family was visibly divided. Her mother wept silently, her face streaked with tears, while her father stared at the ground in disbelief. Emily Thompson, Charles's sister, stood resolute, her face showing no sign of forgiveness. She had never believed Sarah's version of events and had always suspected that her brother's death was the result of something far more sinister. As for Sarah, the weight of the conviction was unbearable. She had thought she could escape the consequences of her actions, but in the end, the truth had come crashing down on her. She was sentenced to 25 years to life, a punishment that would send her to prison, where she would have to reckon with the choices that had brought her here. Outside the courtroom, the media frenzy continued. Reporters crowded around, clamoring for statements from both sides. The public was divided. Some saw Sarah as a victim of a broken marriage, while others saw her as a cold-blooded killer who had taken the life of a man she once claimed to love. But no matter where the public stood, one thing was clear: the tragedy of Charles Thompson's death had changed everything. It was a case that would be remembered for years to come, not just for the shocking crime, but for the way it revealed the darkness that can lurk behind closed doors. The courtroom doors had long since closed, and the dust had settled on the trial of Sarah Thompson. The world had moved on, but for those who had been close to the case, the repercussions of that dark chapter lingered in the background of their lives. The aftermath of Sarah's conviction sent shockwaves through the community, and the echoes of her actions continued to reverberate through the legal system, the Thompson family, and society at large. As Sarah Thompson began her prison sentence, the life she once knew, filled with luxury, fame, and privilege, was now replaced by cold steel bars, concrete walls, and the harsh realities of life behind bars. No longer the well-coiffed socialite, Sarah was a woman stripped of her past, facing a future far different than she could have ever imagined. Despite the years ahead of her, Sarah's story was far from over. Her legal team, led by Mark Harrison, filed multiple appeals in the years following her conviction. They argued that the second-degree murder charge was too harsh, given Sarah's fragile mental state and history of emotional abuse. Some even claimed that the jury's decision was influenced more by media sensationalism than the true facts of the case. But each appeal was met with rejection, and Sarah's sentence remained unchanged. She had a small but devoted group of supporters. Some who believed she had been the victim of circumstances beyond her control, others who simply wanted to see a woman, so seemingly broken, given a second chance. For her family, the aftermath of the case was no less painful. Sarah's mother, who had supported her through the trial, continued to stand by her, visiting her regularly in prison. Her father, on the other hand, distanced himself from Sarah. His grief and disappointment over his daughter's actions had driven a wedge between them, and although he still sent her letters on occasion, it was clear that their relationship would never be the same. But for Emily Thompson, Charles's sister, there was no reconciliation. She had lost her brother, and the woman who had killed him was now locked away, but that loss was something she could never forgive. Emily's life, however, was far from unscathed. The case had consumed her for years. She became an advocate for victims of domestic abuse, speaking publicly about her brother's troubled marriage with Sarah and the dangers of hidden emotional and physical violence. But despite her activism, Emily never found peace with the events that had unfolded. There were still nights when she lay awake, asking herself questions that would never have satisfying answers. Had she missed something? Could she have done more to intervene? And though she continued to fight for justice, the deep pain of losing her brother remained an open wound. Charles's friends, too, were affected by his death in ways they never anticipated. Many of them struggled with the idea that a woman they once admired had been capable of such a heinous act. The relationships they once had with Sarah, filled with social gatherings and laughter, now seemed like a distant, unreal past. Those who knew Charles best, including his colleagues and close friends, found themselves grappling with the loss of a man who had been kind, generous, and deeply loved. The painful truth that his life had been taken by the woman he had once trusted was an unbearable reality that many of them couldn't fully process. The case had far-reaching implications. For the legal system, it raised questions about domestic violence, mental health, and the intersection of media influence in high-profile cases. Sarah's defense team had tried to bring attention to her history of emotional abuse, arguing that she was a product of her circumstances. While this was not enough to sway the jury, it sparked important conversations in legal circles about the need for a more nuanced approach to cases involving victims of domestic violence. Should mental health and emotional abuse play a more significant role in criminal trials? Would a more empathetic approach to sentencing be more appropriate for people like Sarah, who had been emotionally battered for years? These questions still resonated in legal discussions years after the trial ended. The case also had a profound impact on the community. People who had once admired Sarah as a successful, glamorous woman were left grappling with the painful truth about her life behind closed doors. Many came to realize that the perfect marriage they had perceived had been nothing but a facade. Sarah's story was a stark reminder that, no matter how polished a life might appear, darkness could still lurk in the shadows. The case became a cautionary tale, a sobering reminder that appearances can be deceiving, and the truth is often hidden behind layers of deception. Local domestic violence organizations saw an uptick in awareness following the case. Some victims of abusive relationships, who had been silent for years, felt emboldened to speak out about their own experiences. In a strange way, Sarah's tragedy had opened up a dialogue about domestic abuse, and while her story wasn't the one they wanted to tell, it nonetheless shed light on the horrors many faced behind closed doors. Sarah's actions became, in a twisted sense, a catalyst for change, encouraging victims to seek help, to get out before it was too late. But the case also raised uncomfortable questions about society's response to women who act out violently. Was Sarah's emotional breakdown truly an excuse for her actions? Could the pressures of her environment, her broken marriage, her mounting debts, justify what she did? Or was she simply a woman who took matters into her own hands when she saw no way out? The lines between victim and perpetrator, self-defense and cold-blooded murder, became increasingly blurred. In the years following Sarah's conviction, there were still lingering doubts in the public's mind. Was justice truly served? Was Sarah's sentence too harsh, or had she gotten away with something far worse by being sentenced to life behind bars? Some believed that her punishment was too lenient, given the cold, calculated nature of the crime. Others, however, questioned whether she would have been convicted if her actions had been framed in the context of her emotional trauma. One of the more controversial elements of the case was the possibility of Sarah's being the victim of an unjust system. Many wondered if, had she been able to fully express her distress, the outcome might have been different. The appeal process continued for years, with Sarah's legal team seeking any opportunity to reduce her sentence or even secure her release. Public opinion remained divided. Some supported Sarah's appeals, hoping for a second chance at redemption. Others believed that the court had acted justly, pointing to the fact that no matter her history of abuse, Sarah had taken the life of a man who had trusted her. And then there were the moments when the question of Sarah's true motivations haunted the case. Was she driven by rage? Was it a desire for control? Or did she truly believe that there was no other option but to eliminate her husband? Her actions remained a subject of debate, and the uncertainty around the case continued to fuel discussions in the years that followed. As time passed, Sarah's story remained etched in the minds of those who had followed it from the beginning. The case had taught people about the fine line between victim and perpetrator, between a tragic circumstance and a heinous crime. But in the end, a single question lingered: what do we do when the person who hurt us the most is the one we once loved the most? Is there ever truly a way to make sense of such a betrayal? It's a question that has no easy answer, one that transcends the specifics of Sarah's case and touches on the complexity of human nature itself. The story of Sarah Thompson, and the death of Charles Thompson, will forever be a somber reminder of the darkness that can reside within even the most seemingly perfect of lives. That if you're still watching, I just want to ask, if you found this story gripping, if it made you think, if it left you with questions that linger long after the video ended, please take a second to subscribe and like this video. It's the only way to show your support and help us bring more of these compelling stories to life. Don't just watch, be part of the journey. Every like, every subscription helps us keep going.